caucus forum on the dangers of China's Communist Party buying American farmland. And I just want to thank everyone here. I also want to thank my colleagues today. We have Representative Adrian Smith from Nebraska, who sits on Ways and Means and is head of the Trade Subcommittee. We have Representative Dusty Johnson from South Dakota. He sits on the Ag Committee and is chair of the Digital Asset Subcommittee. And then Ronnie Jackson from Florida will be joining, or from Texas will be joining us shortly. And Dan Newhouse is supposed to chair this. He is stuck in a appropriations committee right now. So
it's hard to find good help these days.
I know they get the bottom of the barrel. So with that, I'm just going to say a few statements, then I'll turn it over to Adrian Smith and then to Representative Dusty Johnson. So if you think about it, the number of farmers that we had in 1935, we had 6.8 million farmers in the United States in 1935, and today in 2022, 2023, we only have 2 million farmers. That being said, the key is we have to make sure we're passing our land down to the next generation. And we see that every day. And the next generation, if they don't have the dollars to do that, that's when foreign entities start coming in and buying our land. According to recent figures, 34% of all our producers are over the age of 65, 8% are under 35, and this means that 50% of our farmland is expected to change hands over the next two decades. Think about that, over 50% of our land will be changing hands over the next two decades. Additionally, according to the latest data from USDA, the CCP owns approximately 384,000 acres of our agricultural land. Now, that being said, the concern is this. In 2019 to 2020, the CCP acquired 30% of this farmland. So within 1 year, they acquired 30% of these 384,000 acres. So they are on a path to significantly grow and acquire more of our land. Obviously, the well-known example is the state-backed Chinese company bought land near Grand Forks, North Dakota by an air base, which is home to some of our most sensitive military technology. Which to me is a failure from our administration to have this done. So a couple things that have been done. I've worked with my colleagues on multiple bills to protect our farmland, including the DARE Act that got passed by the House. It's in the Senate, which bans China from buying farmland suitable for ethanol and biodiesel production. I also recently introduced legislation with Chairman Select Committee on the CCP, Mike Gallagher, that would give the committee the foreign investment of the United States greater jurisdiction over foreign land purchases near sensitive locations. And I believe that this forum and other conversations are so vital because we have to get our word out. We have to know, and I'm looking forward to listening to our panelists that will go down this path on talking about that. So in closing, allowing the CCP to continue buying our farmland is a threat to our national food, energy, and security issues in this country. And that's why we must make sure that our farmland for the next generation belongs to the American farmer and not to our foreign adversaries. By acting together collaboratively, we can accomplish our goals and make sure that the next generation of farmers keep the land and that the breadbasket to the world is protected. So with that, I'll turn it over to Representative Adrian Smith for your opening comments.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity. It's certainly a timely issue, timely concern, and I'm anxious to hear from our witnesses here today and that we can have a dialogue. It goes without saying, certainly, that we should be vigilant, whether it's purchase of land, purchase of agribusinesses, other assets close to our infrastructure, very critical infrastructure. So I'm anxious to work together with my colleagues and our communities across the country to, like I said, be vigilant about all of this and to be wise as we move forward. As Mr. Feenstra has pointed out, there's a significant number of acres already in ownership hands that, again, we just want to be very careful here and vigilant moving forward. And I'm glad to be here, anxious to have a conversation. Thank you.
Representative Dusty Johnson, no opinion.
So I serve on the Select Committee on China, and we have had numerous of our witnesses talk to us about how China, in a very deliberate, the Chinese Communist Party, in a very deliberate way, seeks to gain coercive economic power over countries. Now, not just the United States, of course, we're talking about the United States, but I think it is just as big a problem in really the southern globe, where we do see that China has been focused In the last few years, they have increased their holdings of foreign farmland by 1,000%. And they have increased their holdings of agricultural processing facilities outside of China by 1,000%. So we have seen that that is a way that they can advance Chinese interests through investments. And I could give you dozens of quotes from official documents of the Chinese Communist Party, but I'll just give you one as illustration. In a textbook that the People's Liberation Army uses to describe the views of Xi Jinping, it says, "We must gain a grip on foreign government leaders and their business elites by encouraging our companies to invest in their local economies." And so when we look at this country, and the fact that we all know that food security is national security, I think we should be immediately distrustful of any attempt by the CCP to gain coercive economic power over American food. I want to be clear, I'm not anti-foreign investment. If Toyota wants to come build a new car factory in Tennessee and hire 1,000 American welders and machinists, that serves American interests. That makes Americans wealthier. Now, the whole reason that we have CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, is to try to make that, to try to ascertain the extent to which these investments serve American interests. I think CFIUS, for far too long, has had their eye off the food security ball, as evidenced by the fact that although there are a number of cabinet secretaries with a seat at the CFIUS table, the Secretary of Agriculture has never been one of them. And a number of the bills that we are talking about would put the Secretary of Ag or his or her designee there where they belong. And I would just close by noting that this is a strongly bipartisan push. And thank goodness for that, because I do think while the Chinese people are not our enemies, while foreign investment is not an enemy, we do want to be far more thoughtful about making sure that any investment serves American interests.
Thanks for your comments, Adrian. Thanks for your comments, Dusty. Now we'll...
Thank you for your comments, too, Rick.
You're welcome. I'm excited to hear from our panel, and thank each one of you for coming today to spend a few minutes to talk about this extensive issue. And with that, Lars Shenander, we'll have you start first. You're with the Foundation of American Innovation. You have a lot of information on this. I read some of your testimony, which is exciting. So if you could please take your time and have some opening statements.
Sure. Mr. Representative. All right, Chairman.
Is there a reason you told Lars to take his time, but not Adrian and I?
Right.
There's priority.
Maybe don't take all of your time, Lars.
We'll have a
Without
red flag.
time taken. Chairman Newhouse and members of Congressional Western Caucus, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I am a policy technologist at the Foundation for American Innovation, a think tank focused on bridging the gap between Silicon Valley and DC by applying technology to governance and policy challenges. My research on Chinese investments in American farmland has been featured in the Wall Street Journal and on the Ingraham Angle on Fox News.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
My research has found that people and companies connected to the CCP have been buying farmland and building infrastructure next to American military bases. Examples include purchases of land near Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas and near Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota. Chinese investment in American farmland has skyrocketed from $81 million in 2010 to $1.8 billion in 2021, a 1,900% real increase. Chinese investors own a total of 384,000 acres of farmland in the United States. To make matters worse, the Department of Agriculture has not properly tracked these investments. Since 1978, a law passed with bipartisan support, the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act, or AFIDA, has required USDA to track foreign investment in the American farmland. However, the AFIDA program has not been audited since 1989, and outside reporting has found that the program has limited capacity. For example, until 2022, the AFIDA database, the same name as the act, the database that contains all the foreign investment data in the United States, did not include tens of thousands of acres owned by Sung Guang-sin, a CCP-connected billionaire. These sorts of mistakes are embeddable, given that the program's limited manpower. As I discovered for a Freedom of Information Act request, there are only 2 people within the USDA working on the AFIDA program until last year. There are also data quality problems, including limited data on the price of the parcels of land and limited ability to connect the LLC that owns a property to the beneficial owner or who ultimately owns I discovered these flaws through a study of a copy of a database which I received through a separate Freedom of Information Act request to USDA. There's growing recognition among federal and state leaders that Chinese purchases of land, especially those near critical infrastructure, pose a security threat. Our failure to properly track foreign investment in farmland exasperates this threat. If USDA can list tens of thousands of acres of farmland, how much critical infrastructure adjacent property, the farmland to buildings in urban areas, could be owned by CCP-connected individuals without our knowing of it? In recent months, USDA has worked to make foreign ownership of American farmland more transparent, likely in response to a variety of bills that seek to reform AFIDA. USDA recently uploaded all the AFIDA reports since 1978, and last month, USDA finally made the AFIDA database public, making it simpler for Congress and the public to learn the extent of foreign investments in U.S. farmland and where those investments are going. However, more must be done to protect our farmland. First, Congress should pass legislation to restrict foreign investors' ability to purchase farmland and property next to critical infrastructure. Bills to this effect from Representative Elise Stefanik, Senator Mike Brown, and John Testers are worth considering. Congress should also pass a registration to create a national land registry, which would replace the current system, which parcel data is maintained by individual American counties. Representative Mike Gallagher's bill to give the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States jurisdiction over land purchases by foreign adversarial entities is also an approach worth considering. Second, USDA must do a better job of tracking foreign investment in American farmland. Congress should give USDA the authority to more thoroughly investigate foreign investment in farmland to ensure that investors are not hiding the true origins and layers of LLCs. Third, Congress should conduct oversight of USDA to understand why the AFIDA program has been mismanaged over the past 30 years. We need to understand the mistakes USDA has made with AFIDA so that we can avoid repeating them. As I noted, the AFIDA program was last audited in 1989. Congress should require the Government Accountability Office to perform a new audit of the program. Thank you, members of the Congressional Western Caucus, for having me here today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Scheinhander. Thank you for your comments and your thoughts. And now I'll turn it over to you, Gabriela Rodriguez. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So Vice Chair Smith, Congressman Feaster, Congressman Johnson, thanks for having me here today. My name is Gabriela Rodriguez, and I'm with American Compass, which is a conservative think tank focused on restoring an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to our nation's liberty and prosperity. So across issues like globalization, industrial policy, and family policy, we're really focused on tackling the fallout of economic integration with the PRC. So in a recent paper, A Heartbreak from China, and there are copies in the back I'm happy to distribute to your staff, we explore how to protect the American market from subversion by the Chinese Communist Party, and that directly relates to the sort of work related to Chinese farmland ownership. So American policymakers have begun to grapple with the impact of being completely tied up with the authoritarian PRC, and your recent efforts at banning certain farmland sales are certainly a step in the right direction. But it's not the sort of comprehensive approach we need to fully eliminate CCP influence in our markets. And the only way to do that is for Congress to act and ban all PRC-based investment in the U.S. So I just want to make clear throughout this testimony that, any sort of PRC-based investment undermines American sovereignty. It makes American workers, families, and communities beholden to those CCP-linked entities. And second, that CFIUS is the appropriate and the correct starting point for a broader conversation about banning all investment. So unlike the US, the PRC does strategically approach investments in farmland and in food processing facilities. As Mr. Schoeninger noted, we know that large state-backed acquisitions of American food processing facilities are an indication that the Chinese are proceeding strategically. And we know that the acquisition of Smithfield Foods about a decade ago definitely drives this home. As I'm sure you already know, Smithfield is our country's largest pork producer, one of the largest pork processors in the world. And it was an acquisition that was cleared by CFIUS a decade ago. As I'm sure you know, CFIUS has its authority from the Defense Production Act, so it reviews any sort of transaction that's considered a national security risk. And that's a fairly limited definition. We had the committee look at the sale, I raised no red flags, and it went through. And now we're in a situation a decade later where the national security lens seems to be something that we're discussing again, but even so, it wouldn't necessarily set off any red flags. As long as the Smithfield facilities aren't near military bases or critical infrastructure, if it's in the middle of nowhere in a congressional district that's fairly rural, why should it trigger any sort of national security tripwires as far as that sale being an issue? And that really makes clear the point that I'd like to share with you all today, which is that allowing entanglement between the United States and the PRC's economic and political systems is fundamentally impossible. They're incompatible. Whenever a firm is operating in the US that is controlled by an entity that is subject to CCP control, they could be based in a CCP controlled area like Hong Kong, like mainland China, you end up in a situation where that firm has to prioritize the demands of the CCP in order to continue operating. You have that chain of control, that chain of command. So in the case of Smithfield, for example, there could arise a situation where you have pork exports routed to China to meet its domestic needs, causing shortages in the US. Or as a major employer, Smithfield, just like any other corporation or firm that's controlled by a PRC-based entity, could have a situation where they're pressuring members of Congress by threatening to shut down a facility that's the largest employer in a district unless that member takes a vote or a certain position. Ownership by firms in other foreign countries that themselves respect free markets pose no comparable concern. Likewise, no American business operating in China would ever behave in such a manner at the behest of the US government. Why then are we placing American communities and workers in a position where they're beholden to CCP interests? And unfortunately, decisions made by CCP-based firms are already hurting, PRC-based CCP-linked firms are already hurting American families. Last year, Smithfield Foods announced that it would be cutting down pork production in Utah due to a lack of demand in California, and that resulted in the closure of a processing plant in Utah that left the local county, trying to do anything possible to try to keep the plant open. To be clear, Smithfield is not a unique example of how the PRC's influence on the American economy can have a warping effect. It's just a very visible example of how our agricultural sector is already vulnerable and how the national security approach is inadequate to confront the full scope of economic entanglement. So I just want to make it clear that, when I speak about economic sovereignty, I mean that the US, must be able to decide for itself the parameters of its economic activity in its own domestic market. We should not be reliant on foreign-led firms deciding what happens to Americans here. So to that end, Congress should definitely pursue banning PRC-based farmland sales as part of a broader China strategy. We know the Biden administration has a very naive approach to this situation where you have cabinet secretaries and leading advisors saying that we want to pursue, quote, de-risking and diversifying, not decoupling, end quote. We know that's unfeasible. And it's encouraging that Republicans have stepped up with some of their colleagues to support legislation that addresses this in a bipartisan manner, including the bill that Chairman Newhouse and Chairman Gallagher and several members of the Western Caucus that have supported. Protecting U.S. farmland and sensitive sites from Foreign Adversaries Act is definitely a step in the right direction. But I do want to make it clear that lawmakers should focus on the overall broader picture instead of crafting very narrow bills that could be easily worked around or subverted by clever entities and individuals. If the U.S. bans farmland purchases, then PRC-based individuals will just find another way of working around it. They could just buy, land that is rich in other natural resources or buy processing facilities. You end up in a situation where the fundamental problem is still unaddressed, and that PRC control of operations and assets in the U.S. would still continue. So finding a way to develop new policy frameworks and mechanisms is a task before Congress. For instance, U.S. law needs to improve its ability to determine what counts as a PRC-based entity or as a CCP-linked firm. It's critical that Congress continue embracing its legislative authority and set clear standards on foreign investment in the U.S. Exercising oversight capacity to ensure that those sorts of standards are fully followed to the letter is also critical to protecting American economic sovereignty. So I just want to close up with a quick policy recommendation. Our recent report, A Hard Break from China, essentially proposes that Congress should define a class of disqualified foreign investors, and that would include Chinese nationals who are not permanent U.S. residents, PRC-based entities, and any other entity who is affiliated with the CCP or subject to CCP control. Then those disqualified foreign investors should be barred from acquiring U.S. firms, from controlling corporations, or participating in limited partnerships. And that would help deal with several instances where any sort of foreign control could impact the decisions that a business makes. And it would use CFIUS as a framework, with the CFIUS definition as a transaction as the basis for the sort of, prohibition. And I do want to make it clear that this does not extend to personal residences. An individual buying a home is not really the same as a billionaire buying hundreds of acres of land with the intention of plugging into the Texas electric grid. So just to close out, I really want to encourage Congress to take the step of, encouraging a broad ban on all PRC-based investment in the U.S. We know that a narrow ban targeting farmland is a great step in the right direction and perhaps a solid building block to continue improving. But the real danger lies in PRC-based firms having economic leverage over American lawmakers, communities, workers, and families, and using their presence in the American market to advance CCP priorities outside the bounds of our free enterprise system. So even with a farmland purchase ban in place, you can have firms work around and buy other assets. And a broad uniform ban is a lot easier to enforce in a way that streamlines administration and enforcement concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle Rodriguez, for your comments. And now we'll turn it over to Steve Yates from American First Policy Institute. Welcome here, and look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to engage this conversation, and I greatly appreciate each of your willingness to step into this fray. I started studying things China in the 1980s. It was a different environment. Everyone thought Godzilla was eating Manhattan and that Japan was going to own America. And here we are today. I had the pleasure of serving as a missionary in Taiwan as an intelligence analyst at NSA, Heritage Foundation in the 1990s, when we started to get a little bit concerned about Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening policy changing into something different. I would wager to say, as someone who's looked at China and China policy for most of my life, I think we are in a different era, and one of the things that I would like to impress upon the caucus and your colleagues is that there is a good reason why now is the time to take up this topic. I think that China under Xi Jinping is a very different China. And I also applaud those who are capable of distinguishing between the Chinese Communist Party and China. To reiterate as many times as Heartland America can hear it and understand it, the Communist Party is the enemy of the Chinese people and the American way of life and that of our allies. It is not an ethnicity. And in fact, it has been an equal opportunity oppressor and compromiser of everyone of every ethnicity. And so when we're talking about the malign influences of the Chinese Communist Party, I wish that those were limited only to the geography known as China, but unfortunately we can see them in every community in America and in many other parts of our world today. We as a nation and many of our friends made a bet long ago that if we engaged China, just showered them literally with trillions of dollars of investment and concessional lending, privileged access to our systems where they didn't have to abide by the same rules of transparency and accountability as even our own citizens did. That if we did these things, that our differences would narrow and areas of cooperation would expand, the world would be a better and safer place. And I would just assert, just as a matter of empirical analysis, that over the last 4 years, we have seen, with a combination of COVID, fentanyl, and a host of other kinds of contagions, the world is not a safer, healthier place. That a nation that will not respect quality control or the rights of its own citizens is not going to be bashful about the health and welfare of our citizens and our resources. A nation that has been willing to strip its own earth and natural endowment for its own gain is not going to contribute to a high-minded effort to save the planet. And it couldn't be relied upon to be good stewards of our land. I think that with the emergence of this topic of China and ag land, that our nation's leadership has finally connected with our people. That our people understand the inherent and unique value of our land. If we have suffered an open border for long enough, I don't think our people will suffer too much encroachment onto our land by those who seek to do us harm. In China, not that long ago, there was widespread sale of baby formula. And it killed a large number of Chinese citizens, to the point where the Chinese citizens themselves wanted to avoid their brand in order to protect their own children. How could anyone in America, A, want to have an entity like CCP be their neighbor, much less be adjacent to sensitive facilities, but how could they have any confidence that if it ever reached a scale that they would exercise prudent stewardship over the access and the resources that we allow them to come into? From my point of view, and I think those of my colleagues in the America First Policy Institute, no one has the right to buy American land but Americans. For everyone else, it is a privilege. It's a privilege we might want, with good reason, to extend to other people, but not everyone, and under all circumstances. My presence here today is to engage the conversation from the point of view of someone who believes the threat from the Communist Party of China is different than every other threat that the American people face today and have for a long time. I was a child of the Cold War. Some of you might remember that. I was in the White House before, during, and after 9/11 when everything changed. I would wager to say that the scale of this challenge is greater than both of those. And yet we have allowed the Chinese Communist Party to have access to much more of our culture, civilization, and our institutions, and are at the starting point of access to our land. It will be far easier to set the right rules to the road now, before we get to, say, the situation we are with medical supplies. And even now, years after the advent of COVID, we still have a dangerous over-reliance upon Chinese origin pharmaceutical goods. So I think the timing is very, very important, with Xi Jinping being a different kind of leader of the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China representing, I think, a fundamentally different and greater threat to the American way of life than those we have faced in the not too distant past. And the fact that the scale of this is not yet out of control. You have many colleagues in your state legislatures that have been grappling with this. I hope that as you grapple with getting the right rules of the road at the federal level, I do strongly support CFIUS being added to and strengthened and reformed in this process. People in the states probably need to have a model of CFIUS in order to grapple with this too. A key challenge is, how do we help the American farmer continue to have his rights and normal way of life and feed the world, and not put the burden on the farmer alone to know who he's doing business with. I think that the federal government needs to help our states, and our states need to help our farmers and communities know who they're doing business with, because I don't think they want to be in bed with the Communist Party either.
Thank you so much for your comments, Steve Yates. Greatly appreciate that. And we are joined by Representative Ronnie Jackson from Texas. Thanks for joining, Representative Jackson. And if you have any opening statements or comments or thoughts.
No, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate you you being here, and your testimony and your time. I know your time is valuable. Appreciate you coming in. I think we're all on the same page here for the most part. Obviously, foreign investors control 40+ million acres of American farmland already. They control 5.3 million in the state of Texas, my home state, which is more than any other state right now. So I'm obviously interested in curtailing this to the extent that we can. I think when I came in, I didn't have a real big background in the agricultural side of the house. I came from the military, 25 years on active duty in the military, but immediately it became obvious to me that we need to start treating the ag industry like a national security issue. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen happen aggressively over the last year, especially since the Republicans have now had the majority in the House, as we're starting to do that. As you know, I sponsored a bill last time that didn't make it very far, that we're reintroducing this time, the Farm Act, the Foreign Adversary Risk Management Act. And it does a lot of what you're talking about here. It modernizes CFIUS, helps understand the national security implications of these transactions. The bill adds the Secretary of Agriculture as a member of the CFIUS board. It ensures CFIUS recognizes the agriculture industry and supply chain as critical infrastructure, and it requires CFIUS to review any investment that could result in foreign control of any U.S. agricultural business. I think these are all important. I was talking to somebody yesterday, just came into my office, and it just came up in just passing. And it was somebody who's a DOD consultant / contractor that works for the Department of Defense, and he's a lawyer, and I worked with him at the White House, and he's since retired. He's in the Air Force. He's retired, and his full-time job now is he works for the Department of Defense as a consultant, dealing with nothing but CFIUS issues. And they have a huge staff. And then we started talking about where the Department of Agriculture is on this, and they do have a component somewhere down the chain underneath Homeland Security somewhere, where they have one person who's like a GS-13 who deals with the CFIUS issues. Now, it's reasonable that, because we haven't been treating agriculture like it's a national security issue, and CFIUS hasn't been, the the focus of a lot of what's been going on, that they don't have that. But I will submit to you that we're going to have to not only approach this, from a legislative standpoint in pushing these issues to start regulating, increasing the transparency of some of this stuff that's going on with the purchase of land by foreign entities. We're going to have to also encourage the Department of Agriculture to start treating it this way as well. I think appointing the Secretary of Agriculture as a member of the board will probably go a long way. But I think that, talking to this gentleman yesterday, it just reiterated to me that the Department of Agriculture is going to have to start doing the same thing that the Department of Defense is doing with regards to the purchase of foreign land. So I'm just honored to be here, and thank you guys once again for your time, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Congressman Jackson. Now we're just going to open it up to open dialogue, questions. I guess I have one first. So working in the state senate, we looked a lot at this, and Lars, you noted this, that finding the data is really tough of who owns the farmland, and the transactions can be very deep in the weeds of maybe there's a Chinese ownership, a small ownership of a larger company or whatever it might be, or an entity that we never even realized that has Chinese ties, and they're sort of sucking up the land. I guess between all of you, what can we do, and it's how do we sort of identify these small players that are starting to, we have Smithfield, we have the big companies, right? We know who they are. But these smaller entities that are sort of eating up our land, what can we do to stop that? How do we find them? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I was recently in Mississippi, and they had someone with a creative proposal talking about how to add a process into the title closure process, where those that are engaged in a transaction will give certain affidavits about who they are and what they represent. And if over time it is found that they may have made false representation, you have then a process that you could go through and be able to say, well, you were meant to do your due diligence. You said you represented these equities. Turns out that here's the second cousin of the General Secretary of the CCP in Zhejiang Province. Then there would be some ways to have the process begin to open up remedies. I think that there's no substitute for chief executives making this a priority, whether it's a president of the United States or a governor in a state. And resources need to go to those who are meant to track these things. If it's important, then we'll have the money, information, and the personnel to deal with what's a priority. We're not going to get it right on the first bat either. We'll learn as we go.
Lars, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the resource question, but also a lot of it is being creative. We're just not used to looking or screening for certain ties or connections that are pretty visible once you start to take a look at them. It's kind of like the Chinese balloon. We didn't see any at first. We recalibrated our sensors and we saw a whole bunch of concerning things. So I would definitely think that at the federal and the state level, you do need to set aside some time to bring in the sort of experts and financial expertise that could help you find the sort of concerning ties to look for and then apply that broadly for screening.
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues, and my focus is more on the federal level. To start, you can just look at making sure USDA has the proper authority to look into LLCs in the first place. One curious finding I found is they can only look at what's called a third level of ownership. So if you stack enough LLCs on top of one another, USDA simply is not able to look behind the veil. So giving USDA not only the ability to investigate further, but simply more resourcing, as I mentioned earlier. Only 2 people worked in USDA on the subject for over 20 years, and from my own internal conversations, part of the reason the investigations minimized was that when investment in American farmland skyrocketed roughly in the mid-2010s, they were so busy registering people, they weren't able to really figure out if people were actually filing properly.
Gotcha. Thank you, Lars. Johnson.
So Mr. Yates and I both were very careful to explicitly call out the distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people, who you're exactly right. The CCP is the enemy of the Chinese people, and they're the primary victims of that oppression, that repression. I understand, Ms. Rodriguez, I think your point is well taken, that a broader prohibition, not just farmland, but a broader prohibition would be easier to administer and would probably avoid a variety of different types of problematic investment. You also noted that maybe that prohibition could be more broadly cast also on the people that would be prohibited from making those investments. You mentioned all Chinese nationals without maybe green cards here, I think you said, right? Or without permanent visa, permanent resident status, is that what you said?
Yes.
So I'm just trying to, and understanding we all know, but it's worth calling out again, there is a difference between Chinese ethnicity and Chinese nationality, right? A critically important difference. But are we sure we want to go to the point where we are telling a Chinese national with no connections to the CCP that they can't buy an auto dealership or a car wash or make some sort of other investment in the American economy? Help me tease out where the right place to draw the lines are.
Yeah, that's absolutely a great question to ask, and I think that these are the sorts of conversations that members of Congress, especially folks with the background that you have as a member of the Select Committee, private information that I'm not, should absolutely be having. But I would say that, you know, part of the problem is that we just don't have the capacity to be able to screen what is a problematic, let's say, contact or connection or not, even if someone is not a card-carrying member of the CCP. And we do have reports and stories of individuals who may not necessarily be card-carrying members of the CCP still being involved in these sorts of dubious or concerning transactions, where it might seem fine from a national security standpoint, you know, why shouldn't someone have a card ownership, you know, down the road from me if they're from a foreign country of concern? But it really becomes a situation where it's, you know, difficult to draw the line. So even though there may be some certain edge cases where individuals really do have no malicious intent and really do want to become, you know, tied into the U.S. economy and, you know, share in our prosperity, you know, we're more than happy to have them as permanent residents if that's the sort of route they choose to pursue.
Very good, thanks.
Thank you. Representative Smith?
Well, thank you again for your involvement here. And, you know, it was mentioned, you know, the term workaround. I think we always need to be mindful of that, regardless of the subject matter, because oftentimes our intent is one thing, and yet by the time legislation rolls out and new methods of operating can tend to develop, so I'm concerned about that. And how would you suggest maybe we prevent that type of thing, or what should be our approach so that we won't find ourselves having to keep going back and perhaps adjusting some things to respond to unintended consequences that or the workaround that could be presented along the way.
I would try to begin with setting some broad standards. Some of this would just go to equal application of rules and laws when someone wants to move a high amount of capital into the United States and participate in our markets. For far too long, CCP-affiliated individuals and entities have not been subject to the same kind of disclosures and accountability, accounting practices and things like that. So making sure that that is uniform if you're moving a high amount of capital. It's another reason why now is important. We're at a period of very high capital flight out of China. And so that means there's going to be an increased demand for that to go somewhere that is safe and hopefully productive, and land is going to be very attractive on that. But so are other broad funds. And so having some kind of clearer rules of verifying identity and having transparency and accountability in the books of the entities involved, and making them sign some kind of disclosures or affidavits. And if they are found later to be in the problem, then you've got a trail to go up. I think it's going to be very hard to find people on first instance. This is what reminds me of the War on Terror, of how are you going to find someone with ill intent who's crossing over. It wasn't until after 9/11 that it dawned on us we should find people who are trying to learn how to take off without landing. So we're going to learn as we go in this process, but I think it begins with trying to set broad standards that are held to give transparency on the money that's coming in.
Any other?
I mean, I would agree with that, absolutely. And I think too, let's say beyond CFIUS, there are also a number of broad standards that could be set across agencies, you know, when it comes to things like federal contracting or procurement. Every single agency has its own process. Something as simple as setting up a straightforward way to screen for applicants of concern who want to work with the U.S. government at the civilian level would be an easy way to apply those uniform laws.
Yeah, no, I just to start with, or just to make a comment on Congressman Johnson's what he was talking about there. I think he was asking, can we just apply this to everybody, every Chinese national that wants to buy stuff here that may not be associated with the CCP? I mean, a lot of them are, and we know that they don't look like they are, but when you look back into a lot of them have connections there, or whatever. So I don't think we necessarily can do that. I think we have to take this piecemeal, one step at a time. One of the things I'll point out is I think a perfect example is in the National Defense Authorization Act that we just passed here in the House, had an amendment in there basically that said all foreign investments within a 50-mile radius of a military installation would have to have a DOD work with the Secretary of Agriculture and CCP and so on and so forth. So maybe that's a good starting point. It doesn't matter if you're a foreign entity or we suspect that there's possibility that you may be associated with the CCP or foreign government. If it falls within that radius of a military installation, that's one thing you got. But I was talking earlier, that's one of the reasons why DOD is working with these consultants that have all these people on staff, because it's a big part of what they do. They vet all this stuff and they go back and they have to go through many layers sometimes to figure out who's actually getting the money, or who has the interest in it. Sometimes it's not even money, right? Sometimes, the Chinese government, they're opportunistic. I mean, one of the perfect examples is, a couple of years ago, whenever there was kind of a tit for tat between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and they drove the price of oil, into the negative range. Well, what happened is a lot of independent oil companies in Texas, mostly a lot of them in the Permian Basin, couldn't exist anymore, and they went out of business. Well, we found out later on that these shell companies were set up. It looked like they were oil and gas companies out of Houston, but they were really associated with the Chinese Communist Party, and they were buying mineral rights in the Permian Basin, right? But we didn't find that until after the fact. So there's the kinds of things we have to look at, because I think that they really are super interested in controlling our supply chain, not just from the outside, how they've traditionally done with pharmaceuticals and a lot of other stuff, but they want to control our supply chain from the inside, right? That's a new approach that they haven't taken before. But I think one of the best things that we can do to make sure this doesn't happen, using the Permian Basin example that I had, is to make sure that we keep American agriculture strong, right? As long as we have, we don't have farms that are going bankrupt and going out of business, and all this land's not available for the Chinese government to come in and potentially buy up. I think that's one big thing we can do. So I think there's a million things in the Farm Bill in particular that we can do to help make sure that American agriculture is strong. But can you guys think of anything in particular that we should be doing to make sure that we're keeping American farms successful, profitable, and strong, so that we don't even run into the opportunity for these Chinese companies to come in and buy up this farm?
I think the list of how to revive America and make us proud, strong, resilient, and independent, I think is key. I think it's key just fundamentally to meeting the challenge of the CCP generally. All of our options are less risky if America is strong and healthy at the outset. But when it comes to our supply chains, I think that this issue of the processing in Utah is actually more strategically important than it might seem at first, because we have such dependence on processing of everything, including fuel. Refining and processing is absolutely key, and their ability to come in with a high amount of capital, consolidate, and then pull back is at least as destructive as taking land and then holding it fallow. And so I think we're at the front end of learning the ways this can happen. And so I just think having the resources, setting it a priority, and learning as we go is going to be very important. So I think flexibility in our systems, that's why I think CFIUS is one of the models to build and grow on. That's why I think at the state level it's important for them to have something like that. Passing a bill in each of the state legislatures one by one to try to get the problem today will always be at least a step or two behind where the competition is going. So those are just a few thoughts.
Yeah, on agriculture broadly, I would say definitely investing in more ag R&D beyond traditional fields, things like labor-saving devices and mechanization and automation could definitely help farmers be able to continue being productive and generate the capital needed to stay in business.
Yeah, just echo what my colleague said, plus having better data on certain USDA programs. It's not my wheelhouse, but I've off and on FOIA several rural programs that fund farmers, and it's simply unhelpful that information on these programs is publicly unavailable and you have to request federal aid.
And sometimes it's so burdensome from a bureaucracy standpoint that people can't figure it out
Yeah,
and just give up on it.
Just to go back to the AFIDA program, it's still, USDA is in theory going to be digitizing it, but it's still a paper
Right.
process. How much more information will we have if we started to digitize some of these processes? So we know the average age of the American farmer is on the older side, so just making it easier for people to interact with these processes so they're not intimidated by them.
That's a good point, thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, each one of you, for your testimony and your conversation, and I think we all have to work together. I mean,
Yeah,
we're collaborative on this. We see it's a massive issue. It's one of the top issues that concerns the security of our great nation. And we have to be well aware of what's happening in China and what they're trying to do. And it's been a slow process for us to understand, but it's here and it's real. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys, appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.